But we're going to dive right in here, kick today's keynote off. A lot of the content at this year's collaborative has been focused on amplifying impact, improving productivity, and ultimately solving problems faster. And so what we wanted to do this morning is explore that a little bit more and really understand how organizations are modernizing their operations to improve that productivity. So we're inviting 4 tech leaders who are really transforming the way nonprofits, social enterprises, and even many institutions are communicating, generating revenue, and ultimately cultivating their supporter networks. So we're honored to have Suzanne DiBianca, Chief Philanthropy Officer of Salesforce, who's going to lead this conversation with Jason Ritchie, founder and CEO of Flux, Erin Riley, VP of Social Impact at Twilio, and our very own Scott Chisholm, co-founder and CEO of Classy.org. And immediately following the panel, Jason's going to share a special announcement with everyone that I think you're going to love. So please help me in welcoming our panelists.
I'm going to tell you a story. I'm going to tell you about my town.
Good morning, everyone. Is this on? Yes, no? Good morning. It's great to be here in Boston. And I finally figured out on the way over here why you guys chose this venue. This is my second year at Classy. I'm Suzanne, by the way. Figure that out up there. Last year I was at a hotel that was not far away, so I walked back and forth. And this morning I got into a lift, and they said, "Oh, the address is 1 Black Falcon Drive." And I thought, oh, that's exactly why they chose it. So anyway, I'm glad that it's not 110 degrees in here today. I'm thrilled to be here. And I get to moderate the session, which is really fun for me, because these are good friends of mine and great people. And so really the point of the session is to kind of talk about technology as an accelerator for social change, talk about why it's really important to kind of rethink your mission and your impact as it relates to digital tools. Second is to talk about some of the challenges that a lot of NGOs face when they're going through this transformation. And third, talk about what is the return? What's the return on impact? Or what's the return on investment as you kind of go through this process? So hopefully you'll walk away with some insight into those 3 things. And with that, I think really I'd love for you to kind of introduce yourselves and talk a little bit about who you are and what your business is. So maybe we'll just go down the line.
Yeah, they're probably sick of hearing from me at this point.
Probably.
I am also glad it's not 110 degrees on stage today.
Yeah.
Feeling much better up here. It's cool. Scott, I'm the CEO and co-founder of Classy. We are, at our heart, a technology platform to drive social impact. It's an online fundraising platform, now being extended to lots of different areas. We work with over 3,000 organizations at this point. We were founded originally in 2006 as a charity pub crawl. A group of friends raising money for cancer research, actually the American Cancer Society. Blake's here, he's gonna talk about it a little bit later. And we did events for 4 or 5 years, really in the trenches, working with local nonprofits in the San Diego area, and started to understand some of the pain they were feeling, and really around attracting a younger generation into the cause and keeping them around. So we built Classy for our own events. The biggest one was a 5,000-person music festival with Matisyahu as the headliner, and it was a really simple app. It allowed the guests to purchase a ticket to the event, create a personal fundraising page, and share it on the early versions of social media, which was MySpace and Facebook at the time. I'm dating myself a little bit.
Yeah, a little bit.
And we launched as Classy, the technology platform, when the beneficiaries of that event actually said, hey, what you guys have done is pretty innovative. The simplicity and the mobile-first nature of what we had built was, at the time, really innovative. And so we brought it to market, and it's been a wild ride since. So.
Yeah, it's amazing how many good things have come out of charity pub crawls, really. Tons. And I should say that these are, so Erin, you're gonna hear from next, and I've, a good friend of mine, I sit on the board of Twilio.org, also Classy, not yet Flux, but they're all also Salesforce Ventures investments. So we have the opportunity to work with these guys in a pretty deep way, and so it's fun for me to be up here with all of them. So Erin, can you talk a little bit about Twilio and your sort of journey there?
Sure, yeah. So I'm Erin, and the majority of my career has been focused on using technology to really advance social impact at Yahoo, at Google, and now at Twilio. And just in case you're not an expert on what Twilio is, it's basically the communications like text, voice, and video for most of the services you use every day. And in Twilio.org, our mission is to fuel the communications that give hope, power, and freedom. So many organizations are using Twilio to mobilize volunteers through SMS, or teach people literacy through voice calls, or provide discrete counseling through Facebook Messenger. So over 1,000 nonprofits use Twilio, including folks like Red Cross, Crisis Text Line, DoSomething.org. And together, we are working to send 1 billion messages for good. And at this point, we are at 300 million and counting.
It's amazing. And they just, I'll just also add that you just announced your first series of investments at your users conference, and that was really exciting.
We just
to see.
provided our first $1 million in grants.
Yeah, wow. And these guys are a Pledge 1% company, so a lot of you know we're here together, kind of marching around in Boston, but really all over the world, trying to get great companies like Twilio to sort of start early stage philanthropy. So you're like my favorite example.
Absolutely. Without Pledge 1%, we really wouldn't have taken it to the next level. So we are grateful for Pledge 1%.
Thank you. Awesome. Okay, Jason.
All right, I'm Jason Ritchie. I'm the founder and CEO of Flux. We began our life about 10 years ago or so in my former life as a CIO at a foundation. And we began our path building software for foundations. And so our core focus was on building grants management software. That's where we started. We built it within one foundation and then spun it out and have expanded to where we are today. So, that's everything nuts and bolts of what it takes to manage a grant making program. So online applications, workflows, managing payments, reports, all the stuff that it takes to make grants. Our focus has kind of expanded from there to, on one end, helping organizations track the impact of those dollars on the ground. And then later today, we're announcing our launch of the Grant Seeker product, which is focused on kind of the other side of the process and helping the nonprofits manage their grants, but also fostering better communication between everybody in the field. So that's nonprofits to foundations and funders, but also from between nonprofits and between funders as well.
Yeah, that's great. All of you guys have really solved an important issue in the industry. I mean, I know this as a grant maker, as a fundraiser, as somebody who's working with many NGOs on communications issues. So it's been great to sort of see your progress. And I think one of the things that would be useful to everyone here is to know, like, at a macro level, what are some of the trends that you're seeing that are important as NGOs begin to think about, like, where do you start? Like, what are the trends, and why is it important, and where to start as it relates to sort of modernization, but really, I would say, more broadly, using digital tools to kind of power you forward. And maybe we'll go the opposite direction.
Okay, so we see both perspectives where we sit, which is kind of interesting. So I'll start on the grant-making side. And one of the trends I've seen over the past couple of years is this acknowledgement of grantee burden, which is interesting because when I started 10 years ago, it wasn't even on the table. And for a number of reasons, I think that's actually really important. We were just talking about this yesterday, and somebody mentioned CEP, the Center for Effective Philanthropy. They put out great reports. They do surveys of the grantees. That data goes all the way up to the top in the foundation, so it's actually a pretty important report. And one of the questions they asked in the last survey was for these nonprofits to rate their experience with their funders. And the numbers were kind of crazy, that it was 99% rated that relationship as challenging. That's a pretty amazing number. Right. And to get that number out there and to see, from our vantage point, a lot of the foundations and grant makers starting to actually acknowledge it and think about how they're going to change that is actually pretty important. Now, I think there's definitely a long way to go because we're still operating with that old way of doing things, big reports and long grant cycles, but it's shifting in that direction, and I'm pretty hopeful that within the next couple of years, we'll start to really see that trend kind of take root. On the nonprofit side, we're starting to see some trends around kind of the definition of measuring impact, and shifting from this really kind of hard metric approach to more of a storytelling approach. And I think that's resonating really well, and all the way to the foundation, but also to individual donors. And we're starting to see groups like Charity Water and others that really have been able to build a pretty incredible revenue engine out of telling stories about the work that they do and not focusing so much on the stories that have to get reported back to the funders. So really interesting trends on both sides.
So I want to hear also from Aaron and Scott, but one sort of question that I have for you is the sort of the $1 million question, I think, in this industry, which is, do you have sort of a vision for opportunity to sort of crack the nut around sort of the standard grant application process, right? Like they did with the Common App with universities. So you guys are, if anybody can do it in the industry, I think you guys are pretty well positioned.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the Common App is interesting. I've spent a good part of my career talking about common taxonomies and agreeing on nomenclature, and it just kind of doesn't work. And it's really hard to get consensus within the grant makers. I mean, it's just a fact. And I think every foundation will agree, maybe not in public, but I think they'll agree that it's really hard to get that that consensus around how we do things or how we can change things. In the Common App, it's just, I gave up on that a long time ago. And I think our approach has shifted from kind of this soapbox model of trying to tell everybody this is how you should do it, to more of a let's just build it. Let's build the tools that help people do things in a different way, and then hopefully in a couple of years they'll look back and say, "Wow, I can't believe we asked those crazy questions on all of our applications. We didn't need that." So, I want to say that for me, the biggest opportunity here is to foster collaboration, but to do it in more of a passive way. And so, for me, it's more about letting that data flow, rather than the kind of collaboration that requires flying across the country and getting everybody in a room to talk about things. For me, there's so much that's happening inside of both of these organizations, and if we could bubble it up and share it out, that's just going to point us in the right direction. So in a lot of ways, it's a little bit more of a Trojan horse approach than a kind of top-down, try to convince everybody to change the way they do things, because we all know that's almost impossible in this sector.
Yeah, and I just think on behalf of all of my colleagues here in the sector, don't give up on it. Maybe bottoms up is better than tops down.
Yeah.
But we all know how sort of much time that takes to sort of conform to every specific grant maker. So anyway, it wasn't really on our talk track, but I think it's important.
Absolutely,
it's
and we
important,
think about it every day.
Yeah, as a way to drive efficiency. Yeah. Okay, so in that realm, driving efficiency, sort of trends, macro, what are you seeing as it relates to this topic?
Yeah, I mean, I think especially in our specialty of communications, we're really seeing organizations do a better and better job of meeting people where they are, whether it's donors or the people that they are serving. There are still folks who they really want that calendar every month or every year from the organization, but increasingly there are a lot of folks who want to be reached in a different form with more immediate and personal type types of calls to action. In fact, just recently I was on Care Message's website, and they have a stat on there that the open rate for text messages is 98%. And also that people of low income and less educated folks are 2 to 4 times more likely to use text messaging. So it's really about who are the folks that you're trying to reach and how do they want to be reached. And how can you create some opportunities for more immediate calls to action. You know, nearly everyone around the world has a phone, even if it's a feature phone, and designing interaction models that really meet people where they are. It's not just text, it's also Facebook Messenger, voice calls, WhatsApp, or you name it. Like in the communication space, sometimes it feels like there's a new form of communication every month, and being able to adapt because you know that the folks that you're trying to reach are also using that form.
Yeah, it just made me think of, I haven't seen him yet this morning, but if you get a chance, Chris Thomas, who I adore with the Sierra Club, is here somewhere, and we were talking about the recent pullout of the Paris agreements, and the Sierra Club was able to sort of get right out in front of that from a communications perspective and get something like, I'm gonna get the numbers wrong, but something like 300,000 calls into Congress within like a 30-minute time period. So this kind of immediacy of communications.
Or I can also mention ResistBot created a way for people to submit a text message that automatically gets formatted into a fax to send to Congress people. And they have sent 1.1 million faxes to Congress with a peak rate of 109,000 in one day during the Affordable Care Act debates. And so the idea that people want to just write a quick text message like, hey, I support this or I'm against this, and then the technology takes care of it and just sends it, is decreasing the amount of friction for people to get engaged in the causes you care about.
So on the notion of faxes and modernization, Scott, what's your take?
Yeah, I mean, building on what both Jason and Aaron said, I agree with a lot of what they already said. For us, it's no surprise it's the shift still from offline giving to online giving, and then furthermore to mobile. When we started Classy, there was roughly around 3% of giving was done online, which doesn't seem like a lot. Now it's like 9-ish%. But on Classy, from a mobile perspective, when we first launched in 2011, there was about 10% of all visitors were giving through mobile devices, and now it's 55%.
Wow.
In only 5, 6, I guess it's 7 years. But still, that's a really, really crazy curve.
Yeah.
And I definitely think it's about meeting the new heightened expectations of the supporter, which means meeting them where they're at.
Yeah.
It also means providing a remarkable giving experience that we talked about yesterday, which means great aesthetics, great storytelling, all the this isn't new stuff, but it's how do you adapt that into the online world.
Yeah.
And I would agree with Jason. Our company sort of straddles both. I was just talking to the CEO of Goodwill last night at dinner in Boston, who's been in the position for 20 years, and she wants more than anything to migrate online, but she also have donors that have been giving through direct mail $5,000, $1,000, whatever, for 20 years plus,
right.
Her entire tenure there. So they're trying to make the transition, but these tried and true methods in some cases work well. So they're kind of straddling both worlds, which is interesting. And we're looking at a lot of different things at Classy of how we bridge the gap between the two. Yep. In different ways, which I think is exciting. But I also look at the customer service space a lot. Look at what Salesforce is doing and others, with things like AI and chatbots and whatnot, and figuring out how our sector can start to bring some of that technology to the donor experience. Just in a really basic way, ask them why they gave. Be there in the moment when they give, and record that information and contextualize that relationship so that you can have a better follow-up and a better stewardship. Because really, it's a sort of a double-edged sword. People are giving more online, which is great, and they're coming in from all these different platforms, all these different places. But what's happening is the relationship is weakening. because they're coming in from all these places and there's no central way to basically manage that.
Right.
And I think that's going to be a really important thing for the next 10 years, as people naturally, the consumer behavior or the supporter behavior naturally mirrors the consumer behavior, and it'll continue to go online.
Yeah.
But how do nonprofits and really businesses continue to maintain that relationship and keep people coming back just like they were in a direct mail scenario?
That sounds like a softball for a good CRM system. So, Aaron, and we were talking about APIs as it relates to sort of information coming in from various sources. And then there's the sort of knock on government, right, who's moved by faxes, coming in via text, which is at some level sort of ironic, right? Mm-hmm. That you're using sort of new communication tools to sort of push out sort of old systems. So I also, it just makes me think of the paper deluge, right? As we sort of think about the environment, right? And that's kind of like I think we have an opportunity to begin to kind of interrupt some of those systems. And I was thinking that maybe you could sort of help people think through, given the billion messages goal that you have, the 300 million that you're on your way to delivering, the nonprofits who kind of come into Twilio and have never maybe used sort of developer tools before, what are some of the challenges that you see? What's some advice you could give to people to kind of leapfrog maybe some of those challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I think nonprofits are particularly good at seeing the long game. Yeah. And I think just like with any company or organization, sometimes it's hard to know where to start, particularly if that start seems to require a large capital expenditure or board approval. And what we think about a lot is, what if we, as organizations, could think and act more like agile developers and product managers, who really, the blood in their blood is to launch and iterate and experiment. And so that's one of the reasons why we have our Billion Messages for Good program. Basically, we provide Twilio credit to organizations at the level of about 80,000 text messages, which then allows a organization to be able to run a pilot or an experiment and see what is working and improve along the way without needing to provide, have a major capital expenditure or any type of board approval. And it really is, the experimentation is essential for innovation. In fact, experimentation is the prerequisite for innovation.
So if I'm an NGO here, like why would I use Twilio? And like what would I do with it? And to your point about not boiling the ocean, like where would I start?
Let's see. So, I mean, I think a few reasons that organizations are seeing benefits for using Twilio. It has created more personal and deeper relationships with the people they serve. It also has reduced time, effort, and cost to serve those people, and also has helped people do things that they were never able to do before. And I have examples of all those if you want me to rattle a few off. I mean, there's an organization which is in the voting space, Hello Vote, that created a chatbot over Facebook Messenger and text to register people to vote, and they did, and you could register people to vote in less than a minute, and it reduced the cost for people to register people to vote from about $8 per person to less than 98 cents. Or in the idea of doing things at a whole lot less effort, there were American Red Cross is using now text messaging to deploy their volunteers to disasters, and they've reduced the disaster response time by 50%.
That's huge.
So those are some of the reasons why organizations are finding it really valuable to use some of these tools. And I think sometimes the challenge is that it seems like you need to be really tech savvy and an expert to use Twilio. In our history, mostly developers have been using it because we are an API. But what's great is we also have partners that organizations can work with in order to really create solutions or implement solutions that incorporate our APIs.
Great. Thank you, Jason. What's your sort of take on the challenges that you see as you go through these kind of implementations?
Yeah, well, so you mentioned one word there that kind of resonated with me, and I think it's important because we tend not to think about relationships and technology as the same, and because technology means there's no emotion there, right? It does what you tell it to do, and I think in all the work that we do, all of us here, at the end of the day, it's about relationships, and that might not be what drives somebody to donate, but it will be what drives somebody to come back, right? And it's that emotional connection. And so the interesting thing to me is that we tend to think about technology as technologists and separate that from some of the bigger decisions that need to be made. And I always see it in all the orgs we work with. There's kind of this divide between the tech people over here and the executive directors over here. And so for me, the biggest challenge is getting them together and being on the same page, because the technology is basically the facilitator, but if it doesn't really do anything if it's not put to use for like a bigger picture theme. And so almost working backwards from what do we want to do? What do we want to get out of this? And taking technology out of the solution at first, and then finding the right solution from a technology perspective to achieve those goals. And I see it so much every day in the grant makers we work with and the nonprofits that we work with, that they're just completely separate, and they can't be, because it will never succeed that way.
Yeah, it's funny because when I was running .org, for many years, we would get a lot of times, and probably still a lot of times, get the question of like, I really want to do this, but I can't fund it, right? Who can you recommend grant makers that will fund technology? And sort of at the end of my tenure there, which was about a year ago, I kind of got to the place that you're talking about, which is don't submit a technology proposal, right? It's not about the technology. Just embed the technology into the bigger vision of the proposal. When you try to sort of couch it as a separate thing, then you're like kind of hamstrung. You have to go to the capacity builders or the people that do the sort of general operating grants. And I think that the people are beginning to kind of shift and understand, largely the grant makers, that technology is simply an enabler. Right. And to your point about it being emotionless, I think that's true and not true, right? As it relates to the relationship part of it. For somebody who lives with as of yesterday or 2 days ago, now 13-year-old girl, who lives and breathes technology and has constant dopamine shots with the likes and everything. Yeah. There is also some level of, I think, emotion that technology brings out as it relates to meeting people where they are, which is what sort of you all said when we came in. So, Scott, from your perspective, as people begin to kind of think about, crowdfunding versus the $5,000 check that comes in from direct mail, what are you sort of seeing around challenges, like where to start, like how to implement as it relates to, not that Classy is simply a crowdfunding tool, but it is a good part of where you got started. So, like, what is your advantage?
Well, I think that the statement that technology is not a direct problem solver in and of itself is the right one. I think technology opens up the opportunity to solve the problem maybe in a greater way, or drive efficiencies and whatnot. And so a lot of the barriers that we see in implementation, honestly, is cultural. It's adaptation or the inability to adapt to change or want to change. And we straddle both worlds, like we were talking about before. Some stuff works really well, but sort of like there's these macro forces that are moving people that they know they need to move in a certain direction, and so there's sometimes an unwillingness to change. But when, it depends on the size of the organization, of course, but oftentimes we'll go in and say, hey, listen, the new supporter expectation is to be able to fundraise on their own terms, when they want to, where they want to. So let's start small. Let's start with a do-it-yourself fundraising program or something like that they can wrap their heads around, and it's additive. It's expanding the pie for them. It's not just a really expensive rip and replace. That's I think Classy could bring a lot more to the table in that regard. So usually that's how it'll start, and then it'll sort of migrate over, because expanding the pie is an easier sell. That's great, and it's something that's new, and it hits sort of the new generation. So it's two birds with one stone. And then from there, it's, hey, what are the other pieces of fundraising that you're already doing, and maybe a better giving experience, better user experience, et cetera, can really help expand the pie for the stuff you're already doing. And then third, it's more the traditional stuff, the events, the offline fundraising, the direct mail. How do you bridge the gap there in the right way? So usually there's, honestly, in a lot of cases, there'll be a multi-year strategy so that it isn't so intimidating. It doesn't need to be intimidating. So it's exactly what you said. It's fitting the technology into the overarching strategy of the organization, not jamming the technology in, forcefully for no reason. And so I think we always lead with that, and I think that works pretty well.
So it reminds me when we used to go to these conferences here, any really tech conference, up until about a year ago, people would say, how many people here are carrying a mobile phone? And I always thought, that's a stupid question, right? But now, nobody asks the question anymore, right? Because it is just ubiquitous. Now the question is, how many mobile phones are you carrying, and why? And so, as we kind of think about the new frontiers in technology, what are some of your favorite stories? So you were talking about storytelling as a way to kind of capture hearts and minds. And, what are some of the, I have favorite stories just working and knowing with all of you, but I'm going to keep my mouth shut about it and let you tell them. But what are some of your favorite stories and use cases that has kind of demonstrated the power of bringing digital tools into your organization? I'm looking at you, Jason.
Okay, you're looking at me, yeah. Better think of a story quick here. So I think actually one of the more interesting stories on our platform was a story that happened with a large foundation, and ultimately how the access to data and transparency to some operational data led to some big changes that I think kind of affected who they're funding. And so a big part of what we do when we implement Flux for a grant maker is to take all their historical data and put it in one system. And we're very adamant about that, because we want them, when they start from day one, to start to almost be able to reevaluate everything they've done to date. And so this was a really large foundation. I'm not going to name names. They brought in years and years and years of data. And one of the first things they did, and this was executive director level, playing around with some visualizations and, where are our dollars going? Let's take a look at these grants and see where their dollars are going from, geo focus or program area focus. And what they realized was that the big strategy change that they had announced to the board in all their press releases a year ago wasn't really happening. And it wasn't intentional, but basically what they found out was, and this is the data telling the story, which I thought was so fascinating, what they found out was everybody was fully on board. I mean, the program teams, everybody had put together this amazing strategy. But when they went back to their desk, they were kind of back to business as usual, and they were thinking kind of at sea level, not 30,000 feet again. And so they were, renewing grants here and there, and then when they actually stepped back and looked at what they were doing, it wasn't at all what they said they were doing. So it allowed them at that point to call it out, to pivot, make a big change, and that had a pretty profound effect on all of their grantees. And their focus change, I mean, it was literally within months, which in the foundation world is pretty damn fast. And but they would have kind of kept doing things the way they've always done them. But it was, kind of, again, like the technology became that facilitator. It was just, it was there, and the data was always there. It just wasn't in one place, and it wasn't easy enough to click, 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 and see a big picture. I mean, it was kind of game-changing for us, because that was the point where we really saw that shift from, we're not just an operational back office system, like we're providing transparency to data that these these people never had before. It was game-changing for us, for that org, but ultimately for everybody in the areas that they fund. It was pretty big.
Sort of harkens back to Scott's point about oftentimes what he sees, and I think I see it too, probably all of you do, is that there's some level of, I was a former management consultant before I was at Salesforce, and I did change management, and so the cultural, people always underestimate the change management part of it, and the kind of cultural change that it takes. So you can have this sort of beautiful new system, and you guys have a killer UI, but if you're not really looking at the data in a different way, it can just be more of the same unless you're willing to kind of step up and back and say, what insights do I now have that I didn't have before, and what does that tell me about my strategy? So I think the cultural part is really important, and you need to interrupt. Like, you need to sort of intentionally kind of interrupt the process as part of the transformation.
Yeah, and that change management is, I mean, I can't stress it enough.
Yeah.
And when you're talking about organizations with just institutional kind of rigidity around the way that they do things, and this can be any org. I mean, it can be a startup even. When you're coming in and introducing systems and tools that are going to change the way people work, their first reaction is, no way. Like, I already know how to do it. And so you can have the best technology in the world, and you could have buy-in from a group, but if you don't have buy-in from the whole group, it's just never going to happen. And that's something I think that, when we think as an IT department or any other department, and we're rolling out something new and we're super excited about it, and we see this big vision, how it's going to change everything we do, if everybody else doesn't see it, it's just not going to work.
Yeah.
It's going to fail. So really thinking about when you're rolling out new systems, new technologies, or really anything for that matter, you have to make sure you get everybody on board. They have to feel like they're a part of that process. Otherwise, you're just rolling a boulder uphill. Yeah.
Engaging business, I think, is key. What about, there's so many stories. So you talked about Hello Vote. What are some of the other sort of best practices and use cases that you love to share?
There's so many. But one that ties to what you were saying with both the change management, but also do you actually have the data to then use, is related to Path International, who I believe is here also. And they are focused on eradicating malaria in Zambia. And they were really faced with a challenge of getting the data on cases of malaria that are occurring out in the field. And they were having a hard time getting that data from the field workers. And so they implemented something as simple as a text reminder to submit that data. And from the change management standpoint, what you're thinking is it reminded that field staff that that data is needed and is being paid attention to and is being used. Otherwise, they probably submitted it, they just never knew if it was even valuable. But to get that reminder, oh, you haven't submitted your data, they had an increase of 31% of reports being submitted from the field, which is essential to what they're trying to accomplish, because then they have the data to improve their programs as well as to report the impact to their funders and to their stakeholders. And we see that example propagating because pretty much all nonprofits are focused on transparency of impact. And so, CamFed is also doing that with regards to the thousands of teachers that are trying to help educate girls in rural Africa. They now use text reminders and get more of that data that they can use to improve their reporting. And then also tied to the point with regard to experimentation and iteration, the San Francisco SPCA just last month created an MVP sort of pilot program where they created an app where people could submit their stories about their favorite animals. It was an app that took about a half day of a volunteer developer to create, so something that was a small sort of investment, and then they were able to launch it at a conference, test it, get people to interact with it, and get some lessons learned before they plan to roll something out similar for their 150th anniversary celebration next year. So again, that idea of try something small, see if it works, iterate, improve, don't try to be overwhelmed with creating the big solution. There are small bite-sized pieces.
Yeah, the don't try to boil the ocean part, I think, is really key. And Scott, I know that I love the sort of make the pie bigger is really important, especially as it relates to fundraising, right? Like that's a much easier sell than sort of rip and replace everything you know how to do. And I have participated in so many Classy campaigns. We did it for UCSF. I did one last week for a school fundraiser. We have people just kind of spinning them up left and right? It's been super fun. And then it sort of comes back to how and do you sort of centralize that data? So from your perspective, like what are some best practices? What are some stories that have sort of illuminated this?
Yeah, so I'll start with a simple one that happened last year. We always hold up my favorite organization, Team Rubicon, in a highlight because of the amazing work they're doing. They're a veteran-led disaster relief organization, and they do a lot of things right, and they're always so nimble. It's led by a group of really progressive folks, so it's really not surprising that they've been one of the ones pushing Classy forward in a lot of ways. But the example actually isn't about them. It's an example is about the Baton Rouge Foundation when the floods happened last year in the South, who are a more traditional organization that didn't do a lot online. And basically with Classy, in a matter of an hour, they were on the platform and they were operating like Team Rubicon. And they raised about $1 million in like 48 hours.
Wow.
And so, it's that type of thing where you can transform an organization, break through the cultural barriers, and what seems so simple to one organization, like crowdfunding is just, it's part of their Team Rubicon's nomenclature, it's part of what they do. This is totally different. But if the technology can help them, adapt that quickly and launch something so easily and keep their brand intact and do all the things that are important, that's super powerful, I think. And then beyond that, I mentioned earlier that fundraisers want to, support an organization on their own terms, and sometimes that means not even on Classy. It might mean on the dozens of other platforms that are happening, or through a point of sale system, or whatever, wherever they're in the moment. So I think a challenge for us is how do we actually evolve with the times and embrace that, and have Classy become a platform that can connect into multiple things similar to Salesforce. We already have an amazing integration with Salesforce on the relationship side and the CRM side. It's phenomenal, and so the same with the Marketing Cloud. But on the service side and on the experience side, we're looking at integrating with all sorts of stuff. Maybe the service product that Salesforce has, chat products, whatnot, like I mentioned before. But I think connecting all of the systems that you have and making sure that Classy's roadmap is helping the organizations drive that forward to create more of a connected experience for that supporter that enables them to basically fundraise on their own terms, but also allows the organization to manage that relationship over time in the right way, I think is something we'll be focused on for the next several years.
Yeah, and it's interesting as you're talking, kind of made me think there's always going to be some level of overlap, right? I think the platform play is super important. It was super important to Salesforce, to Twilio, I sort of think to all of us. And there's a certain amount of redundancy, of which we do, that overlap. That whether it's fundraising or grants management or service or communications, like there's places where we play similarly, and then places where we play very uniquely. And I think the key is not getting hung up in the overlap, right? It's like, how do we integrate really well? And so it's been a great ride for me at Salesforce to be able to kind of work with all of you to build those integrations and focus on like the future and where we can go, not where we are already together slightly differently, but what is like the kind of new frontier that we can do via an integration. So I think you're right. I think that people have to be thinking about whether it's a point of sale system or a pub crawl or a 5,000 direct mail thing, like how can we, and all of us, work together to kind of create a more unified experience for our NGO partners.
And then it's additive. It's not.
And then
it's additive. It's not competitive. And Action Against Hunger said it well in the keynote yesterday, where they're trying to drive collaboration and get the ego out of it. It doesn't matter. I mean, we'll benefit by connecting the dots for people and truly driving value versus just worrying about being so narrow-minded and worrying about our little sliver.
Yeah. So I want to open it up for questions just because I think we all like that, and we want to make sure we're not like just talking to each other about things that you don't care about. But just before I do, can you guys just hum like a few sentences on ROI? Because I think that's important as people are thinking about like how do I get this investment done, and what can I talk about as it relates to sort of the additive component?
Sure. I mean, really simply, from a user experience standpoint, we spend a ton of time optimizing the little details that probably people don't think about, like the button shape and the form things and the stuff that you don't even want to worry about. But our conversion on forums and fundraising pages is typically 30% plus. The industry average is like 10 to 13%. So it's basically double. Retention on our side, industry average is like 40%, and there's some, Joe from the Honor Foundation was up here, and they're doing a lot of stuff that isn't just on Classy, but Classy's helping him bring his retention rate up to 80%. Yeah. That's not the average, but that's going to be a focus for, as we mentioned, that's going to be our focus, is how do you get the retention rate up as much? But general ROI in the platform is about 15x on the investment you're making on average, and for medium-sized organizations to even large organizations, it's 29x.
Wow.
So it's pretty high, and a lot of that comes from honestly better giving experience on the front end, and we're doing a lot of work on the back end to get retention up too.
That's awesome. And the Baton Rouge example was a great example. And Jake, who I saw earlier from Team Rubicon, just kudos to you. If we get a whole bunch of organizations around the country, world operating like Team Rubicon, like that's amazing.
Yeah, with Twilio, the ROI depends on how you want to use Twilio. Regarding the fundraising space, I will pile on the love with Team Rubicon. Both Team Rubicon and Action Against Hunger and other organizations have used text to provide reminders or little nudges or thank yous for fundraising when in their direct fundraising campaigns. And they have seen both an increased engagement with the folks they reach that way, as well as higher donations per person that way. And then if you want to use Twilio to better engage with the people that you're serving, I've been talking a bit about those examples throughout the talk, but Caravan Studios, it helps people, homeless people, find a bed. And they reduced the time to do that from over 2 hours to less than 5 minutes.
Wow.
So that's like the reduction of time, effort, cost, ROI.
Yeah, great examples.
So the ROI with Flux, and actually this is true on both sides, the funders and the nonprofits, I kind of like to break them up between kind of the left brain and the right brain. So on the operational side, we really look at speed and efficiency and kind of streamlining of processes. And it's interesting because it's not part of our pitch, really. And this is kind of when we get to the soapbox versus the just make it happen. But on average, across all of our grant makers, we've seen an over 300% decrease in the time that it takes to process and make a grant. And that's actually pretty significant. And actually, the first place we launched, they were actually already fast. But it took about 90 days or so to process, and from the point that an application comes in to the point that the dollars go out the door. And within a month or two of launching Flux, they brought that down to 27 days. And that has a huge impact on the field, especially when you're funding climate projects or policy-driven work. I'd like to see it go from 27 to 2, but again, we're heading in the right direction. And I think there is an ROI, and this is where I start thinking about how we measure things, because there's the quantitative and there's the qualitative, and so there's a lot of things that are just not as measurable. But in building a platform where we have this connection between the nonprofit and the funder, a really big ROI for us, and a lot of the feedback we've gotten actually from the grantees, is that it's helping to foster a better relationship. Because there wasn't as much of a connection before. And again, this is where technology kind of steps in, but then gets out of the way. And as data starts to flow, it starts to spark conversations. And these are conversations with busy people on both sides. So nobody's picking up the phone and calling and saying, hey, let's talk about this latest thing. But when the data starts to flow in more of a real-time fashion, it sparks those conversations, and then those relationships start to build. And that's a really big part of where we're focused today. I feel like in a lot of ways, the streamlining and efficiency pieces are a bit of a commodity in some ways, but if we can be kind of the intermediary in between that's just helping foster better relationships, ultimately that's going to drive better impact. It has to.
Awesome. So can we do that? We've got about like 6 or 7 minutes left. Maybe we can just take like, I don't know, 3 questions, sort of rapid fire, whoever, if you have them, and then you guys can just kind of riff on whatever you think you can answer. So we won't answer the questions one at a time. Let's like get a couple on the table, and then do it that way. Is that cool? Yeah.
Thanks for a great panel. Thanks for a great panel. I'd love to hear a little bit more about technology relating to reporting back on impact.
Okay. Technology relating to reporting back on impact. Cool.
Yeah, specifically to individual donors versus big funders.
Okay, awesome. What else is on people's minds?
Hi, thank you so much. Quick question on how you're using this globally to measure impact, because I loved learning about Passport yesterday. So just more on what you're doing in your individual organizations if there's time. Thanks.
Cool. Okay, so global reporting impact, especially as it relates to individual. Mr. Hatch.
Good morning, great panel. Wells Hatch with City Air. Being technology service providers, interested in the work you might be doing to support standards of whatever sort. In this line of work, we're uniquely situated to be able to support standards. I'm interested in how that finds its way into your roadmap.
Good, awesome. 3 really good questions that I think are broad. So let's talk quickly around global, individual, and sort of standards.
I can hit the impact piece, and then for any other additional questions, we're happy to get off stage and answer them as well. Jason's got a big announcement he wants to share soon coming up here. On the impact piece, it's interesting because we're working a lot more closely with partners like Flux to figure out how to bridge the gap between the impact tracking and measurement on the grant side and what organizations are doing on the individual side. And through the Classy Awards, we actually came up with our own methodology, and we're still refining that. And it wasn't necessarily a top-down approach. It was through the nomination process that we sort of came up with a framework for organizations to measure their impact. But we're working with Flux, and it's all on the table. And we're trying to figure out the best way to basically bring those 2 worlds together so that there's more seamless. From an individual's perspective, we agree with what Jason said earlier on the fact that the feedback loop and the speed in which the individual receives the impact information back, even if it's in a bite-sized chunk, is actually in some ways more important than giving them some huge comprehensive report. And so we're trying to figure out how to build the tools to shorten that feedback loop right within Classy, whether we're the ones helping with the impact tracking or it's being done in a different system and it could be delivered back to Classy so that the organization could deliver it back to that donor immediately when it's ready.
And to build on top of that, you mentioned you were interested specifically, reporting back with the individuals. I think they're the same. And I think part of the problem is that we see them as different. And, I focus more on that grant maker relationship. And traditionally, it's been more of a top-down approach. Here's your money. Here are the 3 metrics I want you to report on. And I just don't think that works, right? And so I think, and this is why we're on stage together and why we're collaborating so much, because we're both seeing that from either side. And I think it is much more of a grounds-up approach. And I think that everybody within the sector needs to get comfortable with the fact that the boots on the ground are the ones who know what should be measured. And so what we want to do is facilitate that conversation. Again, I'm not going to get on the soapbox, right? We just need to start doing that and start kind of celebrating what's happening and that data that lives over here. And then eventually, I think the sector shifts. Right now, it still is much more of a top-down approach, but it's changing. It has to change, and I think that's kind of where technology comes in. I think, to your point, that's where collaboration between all of us on the stage come in, and that's also kind of where standards come in, right? We don't want to be the ones who own, like, the impact standard. It has to be something that we all share. And whether you're capturing it in Flux or you're capturing it in Salesforce or Classy or whatever, the key to me is that we're all able to take that data and then learn from it. So we have to get comfortable with the fact that we're not going to be able to define everything up front and then report on it. I just don't think that works. And I think that we have to learn as we go. We have to be iterative, and we have to kind of look at that data as it's flowing and then make some decisions on it as we go. And I think those taxonomies and those standards kind of come out of that work. I think too often we kind of think about it backwards.
And then, as far as measuring and then reporting impact to individual supporters, the same platform that you can use to nudge people to donate, most likely you're not saying, hey, please donate. It's a very tailored message in the form of communication the person wants, as well as the message that often has to do with, hey, thank you for donating last year, and this is the school that you helped build. Picture. Like, it is so much more tangible in that way, and is tied to that individual's cycle of donations. So you can't just, slap the long text, annual report into a text message, obviously. It has to be tailored.
Yeah, again, that's the storytelling data, right? That's the pictures. And, I remember one of the key kind of turning points for me as a CIO at a foundation when I thought everything was inherently measurable. We were in a board meeting, and we were funding work to basically shut down coal plants. And so, clearly that's measurable, right? We can measure tons of carbon, and when we shut it down, basically that's our impact. And so we put together these beautiful visualizations about all the impact we were having. It was very metric driven, and one of the board members stands up and says, I'm not the smartest guy in the room, even though he was, but like, what happens to that coal? Like, does it get put back in the ground? And I'm like, shit. Yeah. No, it gets put on a barge, it gets sent to China, and they burn it there. And so, which is why we also had a China program. But it was kind of that point that I realized, look, we're doing great work. And it's clear, shutting down a coal plant, if you believe in that stuff, is good work. But can I really put a metric on it? Yeah, but not really. And so that was a turning point for me when it was pretty clear that we call it measuring, but it's about, again, that combination of the quantitative and the qualitative. And more and more what I see is it's the storytelling data, it's the videos, it's the pictures that resonate so much more.
Yeah, and I think that to all the NGOs here, good thing you've got Jason on your behalf, sort of working with grant makers to say, sort of knock it off with these sort of metrics are key and important, and so are the stories that you tell. So thank you, all of you. Great job. Yeah. And I'm going to turn it to you, and we're going to take off and leave Jason up here.
My heart is breaking, safe ground's out of sight. Your lips are moving and words spreading.
I was pretty fun. So here we are. We're at an event called The Collaborative. So I want to talk a little bit about collaboration. So last fall, we gathered a group of funders and nonprofits. We brought them together in a room. And we brought them together to talk about measuring impact. And so we started with the grant makers first. We asked them, hey, how do you measure impact? And so they explained their logic models, their suggestions for common taxonomies, their metric-driven theories, really detailed, very thorough work. And then we turned and we asked the grantees about their approach towards measuring impact. And they responded, well, how do you want us to measure impact? And I want to say I was shocked, but really I wasn't. And so clearly it wasn't that these nonprofits had never thought about how to measure the impact of the work they do. And it was actually quite the contrary. In fact, it turns out they all had an amazing wealth of data and knowledge and learnings that they just captured during the normal course of their work. And so the problem was that nobody was asking for that data, and so nobody was sharing it. So at Flux, we work with some of the largest grant makers in the world. Ford Foundation, Knight, MacArthur, Surdna, Getty, really big grant makers. We see $7 billion in grants a year run through our platform, and those grants go to over 200,000 nonprofits. So we sit at this intersection of funders and nonprofits, and we see how these relationships play out every day. And so we see when they work well, and then we see when they kind of don't work so well. And I think we can all agree that funders and nonprofits share the same passion, that same passion for the mission. I mean, that's why we're all here together today, right? So we're in this together, and we're in it for the same reasons. But sometimes it may feel like we sit on opposite sides of the table. And sometimes these relationships, they become kind of transactional, you know, no collaboration or actions with really no shared view of success. So, you know, some of you might be nodding. Some of you are maybe nodding on the inside because you're sitting next to one of your funders. But it's a perfectly reasonable response. So, I mean, look, here's the thing. A foundation's job is not to give grants, right? And a nonprofit's job is not to apply for grants. Your jobs are the same, right? To focus your time, your energy, your resources, your passion on driving change within some of the most important challenges of our time, right? Thank you. So our job, we're a technology company, and you know, all the technology companies up here, whether it's Salesforce, Twilio, Classy, our job is to listen to you and to learn from you and to build solutions that make all of you more effective and more impactful. So this week we're launching a new product at Flux. This has been a long time coming. I'm incredibly proud of it. I'm excited. It's called Grant Seeker. It's built for you. I want you all to try it. And it's a system that's built from the ground up that connects the nonprofits with the funders and helps us all work cohesively together. It allows our sector to achieve the type of collaboration that we all seek and I think so desperately need. And now, I mean, we talked about it earlier. Is technology the be-all, end-all, you know, solution to collaboration? It's not. And so I'm not going to try to convince you that it is. But I do believe that technology can be that powerful facilitator, especially when it comes to collaboration. So I'm going to give you an example. One of our foundation partners doing amazing work in Africa, in Malawi. And they were leading an initiative to fund investments in micronutrient powders. So on the metric side, they were focused on measuring three key metrics: availability, awareness, and consumption. But more importantly than the metrics, and this is the reason I bring this story up today, more importantly than the metrics, they chose to communicate openly and iteratively throughout the course of this project. So they were working collaboratively together. The project started off really well, actually. They hit their targets pretty quickly for availability. Awareness was really high. But consumption, which I think you would argue is probably the most important metric, was stuck. And it was stuck at like 40% or so of their goals. So they looked at the data they'd been collecting, and they did it together. And it turns out the solution was incredibly simple. So the places where they put the distribution centers were sometimes like 3 miles away for where all the communities were. And you know, it took getting together and looking at the data and really thinking about it to come up with the solution, which was basically just to move the distribution centers. I mean, it was really that simple. And so the important thing here is that normally this change would have been pushed to the next round of funding. Why? Because the funders wouldn't have found out what was going on until the final report was submitted. So instead, the group was using real-time data, and they were creating insights into the progress of their work. They were making decisions, changing course midstream. And so they made these changes, the consumption numbers doubled, they pivoted their strategy, they did it together. And they did it in response to what they were learning. They were learning from this data on the ground, and they were learning in real time. So this is nothing less to me than the future of philanthropy. Instead of reporting on formal requirements alone, you know, we need to document real-world learnings. We need to do it iteratively. We need to work together. And a change in how we interact with each other can disproportionately impact how effective we are on the ground. So this, for me, this is an incredible example about how better information sharing and tighter communication can allow us to capitalize on these insights right now. So this is what we want to see more of. More collaboration, better collaboration, greater transparency on both sides. And this is what the Grant Seeker product is all about. So I'm talking about passive collaboration, this free flow of insights, nonprofits sharing the stories, capturing the moments that give give us this continuous big picture view into what's happening on the ground. And our hope is that this knowledge, it sparks curiosity, and it sparks action, and it allows your everyday work, the boots on the ground, to be seen, heard, to be supported. I mentioned it earlier about the tops down and grounds up approach. Philanthropy today, it can't be about that top down. And it's not necessarily just about ground up. The work has to be done together. And we all have to sit at the same side of the table. We have to learn together, and we have to do it continuously. We have to create, and we have to measure impact together. So thank you for continuing to inspire the innovation and advancement of this sector, all of you. Please join us at the Flux Lounge today. Meet us and learn more about our vision for this sector. We'd love to share Grant Seeker with you. It's free. Come give it a try. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the panel, and I appreciate your time today.